Hi guys, so I did promise I would post a video at the start of every month telling you what I've read. If you like reading, you might get some ideas, you might have read the books. If you have, let me know what you thought of the books in the comments. So I'll get started. I know I said earlier this month, like at the start of the month, that I was going to try and get through like 2 books a week. That hasn't happened because everything sort of in my life went up in the air a bit, but I got through a few books, probably about like 1 a week, I would say. So the first book I want to talk about is Curing Queers by Tommy Dickinson, and it's Mental Nurses and Their Patients 1935 to 74. So this book is basically about the history of conversion therapy, and back then it was known as aversion therapy for homosexuals and transvestites, and it took me a long time to read. It took me almost 3 weeks to read. I found it really interesting, but it was really hard to read because the stuff they did was barbaric. It sort of like starts off, I didn't know a lot of the stuff in this book, like the history of conversion therapy. I always thought the churches had started it, but it was actually the Nazis who did. It was a psychiatrist who worked for Hitler who first came up with the idea. And it was basically torture. And then they were talking about nurses, how nurses back in like the 1930s, 40s, pretty much to the 50s, really had no education. They just followed orders. They were just, yeah. And then it goes on about how then nursing became a university course, and nurses learnt the theory, and then they started questioning a lot of the practices that were used for, like, in mental health especially. It talks a little bit about other mental health conditions, and then it talks about how there was a huge commission into mental health, and it talks about how the homosexuality was taken out of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for which psychiatrists use to diagnose a medical condition, a mental health condition. And the argument was that being a homosexual didn't adversely affect your life. So part of the whole thing with psychiatric disorders is it has to affect someone's daily life, that they can't function normally, basically, or they have trouble functioning normally. So that, things like bipolar and schizophrenia and clinical depression, PTSD, things like that, things sort of I've talked about in my mental health videos, that sort of stuff. And they made the argument that, it didn't affect their daily life, and what it was the homophobia was affecting their daily life. So it was a really interesting read. It is sort of set out like a textbook, and it's got so many, like, I've looked at a few of, they have so many. The author of this really did his research. Like, at the end of every chapter, there's like 3 or 4 pages just of references. I will read you out a quote from the Hitler. I should have planned this better. But, so it sort of goes into, also, like, police would basically go out and sort of lure homosexual men in particular, and then charge them. And it was just really a lot of horrible stuff, and the treatments were barbaric. And then it got talks about nurses, how nurses would coach patients about how to behave, and then told them, how to behave so they'd be discharged. And they actually found that they had a 0% success rate with this aversion therapy, and it's the same these days. So, yeah, I'll have to find the quote. I can't find the quote at the moment, but it's a really good book. I really recommend this one. I found it really interesting. Then I already started reading it last year. I'll show you the other 2 books as well. So there's 6 books in the series. It's a Mortal Instruments series. So there's City of Bones, which I started last year. And then there's the City of Ashes. And I've read this series so many times. It's one of my favourite series. And the first book I found at the start was a bit slow and hard to get into, but once you get into like the other books, it's really hard to put them down. So I read book 3, which is City of Glass, and book 4, which is City of Fallen Angels, and book 5, which is City of Lost Souls. And it just has so there's shadow hunters who protect people, which they call mundanes, who are not shadow hunters and don't have any magical abilities, are not downworlders. So the downworlders are vampires and werewolves and fairies, warlocks, and so basically they stop demons coming from other dimensions to the world. It's set in New York, and they've got this mythical country called Idris, and that's where the head of all the shadow hunters are. And it's I found it really interesting looking into other countries. It sort of shows how people can be corrupt. People, want power. Governments can be corrupt. And it sort of shows that, there's 2 really, evil characters in it, which is a man, and then he dies, and then his son. And it's sort of in a way they are right that sort of the government of the shadow hunters, called the Glaive, is corrupt, but they're not going about it the right way. And then there was experimentations. Lilith comes into it. She gave blood to one of the shadow hunters to inject into a pregnant woman, which made her child basically a demon, and he then wants to basically destroy the world. And it's really interesting. I did try and finish the last book, which is City of Heavenly Fire, but I didn't. I've still got this much to go. I was up reading till 2 o'clock last night. It's a really good series. It's really hard to put down. So they're sort of the books I've been reading. I know the last ones were pretty boring because they were from the same series, but it's one of my favourite series and I just want to share it with you. There's also the Netflix series of it. There's also the movie. Do not watch the movie. I found the movie of City of Bones really, really bad, and I watched it after I read the book, and I'm kind of glad I did, because I don't know if it's because I read the book so I knew the story, but it was really hard to follow. Went so far from the books, it was ridiculous. I don't mind the Netflix series, which is called Shadowhunters. It's pretty much the basis of the book, really. Like, they've sort of mixed up a few things. A few things happen in it that didn't happen in the books. Yeah, and the author Cassandra Clare, I love all her books. She's also got, like, she's written so many books on this one world, and I love it because it's sort of set in a real place, and it's sort of like, I love fantasy and stuff. I didn't really like Twilight, but I love it because it's sort of like, so, you know, like Twilight's about sort of shapeshifters and vampires, and Harry Potter's about wizards and witches. I like how this series is about something sort of different, but it still has those elements I like with the vampires and the werewolves and warlocks and all of that. And so she's also written other ones. So there's one series, it's called Clockwork Princess, Clockwork Prince and Clockwork Angel, which is set in the 1800s in London, which are the ancestors of a few of the characters that appear in, like, the main characters from this series. And so she brought them out after this series, but it was really interesting to read that series as well, because it's sort of like the warlocks and vampires, because they're immortal, they appear in sort of those books as well, and it's really interesting to sort of, you know, see the difference. And then she's got another one, and she's just brought another book out. It's Lady Midnight, Queen of Air and Darkness, and there's another one, I can't remember it because I've only read that series once, and I haven't read the last book yet. But that's set after these books, and, like, it's about a different sort of family, but the characters from the Mortal Instruments series appears in it. So yeah, and she also has things like the Magnus Bane Chronicles. He's probably one of my favourite characters he appears in all the books. He's a warlock, and he is just so funny. And if you've seen, like, even the Netflix special, like, that's his personality in the books. I think he's a little bit more sassy in the books, but I just love him. So they've got a collection. It's called the Magnus Bane Chronicles, and it's sort of a collection of shorter stories about his life, just things he got up to, things like that. So I really enjoyed that book as well. And there's also the Shadowhunters Codex. So I haven't read all through that yet. So Shadowhunters, because I have to learn about, like, demons and downworlders and things like that. It's basically that, and it sort of goes into the history and the weapons that appear in the books. So it gives a bit more detail, so that's interesting. And then they've got Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, which is, yeah, like, they've got, like, this school, and it's where Shadowhunters can train. Like, they have institutes, things called institutes in different cities, and then Shadowhunter families are sent to these institutes and run them. And then the ones that live in their home country, Idris, go to the Shadowhunter academy and they're trained there. And at the institutes they have like tutors and stuff, and so it's really interesting, like, because the Shadowhunter home country really doesn't play a huge part in the books. Like, they go there a few times, but it's not, you sort of know what it's about, but you don't really hear about children there and how they're trained and all that, so that's really interesting. So, yeah, I am going to go and now read more of the last Mortal Instruments book. I get to the point where, like, because I know it's the last book, I want to finish it because it's so action-packed, the last book. And it's probably my favourite book of the series. But I also don't want it to end as well. Like, yeah. I really love reading, and it's sort of like, if I know it's a good series, or if it's a really good book, I like, when I know I'm getting to the end, I want to know what happens, but then I also don't want it to end. So, yeah. So next month, I will tell you what I'm reading. If you have any suggestions for books I might like, I'll read anything, really. Put them below, or tell me what you've been reading. Yeah, thanks to the people who subscribed, and I'm gonna go and read. I went to see Bohemian Rhapsody again today because I loved it, and it was a sing-along one, and everyone was like singing and clapping, and it was really fun. So yeah, anyway, that's just a useless fact for you. Anyway, I will see you guys next time, and thank you to my new subscribers. And yeah, if you like this sort of stuff, please subscribe and share. And yeah, tell me what you've been reading. Alright, see ya.